Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this wonderful event tonight, the UNESCO Oration, and welcome to Deakin Downtown. My name's Brenda, and I have the great privilege of introducing the Welcome to Country, and I would also like to pay my respects and acknowledge any Aboriginal people in the room, particularly elders, past and those present. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here tonight, and you know what's most exciting? The room is so full, and the buzz in the room is truly exciting, so thank you very much. But I have a script I'm supposed to follow, so I'll get told off. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Bill Nicholson, a Wurundjeri man who's here to offer an acknowledgement, a welcome to country. Thank you, Bill.
Yep, no problem.
Thank you, Brenda, and thank you to the people behind organising the event and inviting a representative of the Wurundjeri community here. It is a great sign of respect to add a welcome to country to people's gatherings, so I'd like to say thank you. And also I'd like to, just a bit of a remembrance for me, Deakin University, when I was a young fellow many moons ago, gave me a little bit of a a push into the direction of cultural education, as I started at university down at Deakin University down at Warren Ponds there in the Koori unit, which was a great way to meet people and to be part of the education system. And now I manage the Wurundjeri Education Department, which is a great tool, or as I like to say, the spear to knock down ignorance, because it exists everywhere out there. So I'd like to start the welcome to country in the language of this land. Now, for tens of thousands of years, the Woiwurrung language has been spoken on this sacred country. Only the last 180 odd years has it been banned. And we're trying to revitalise that as part of our healing today. So, Wamijika, Gamalamangil, Balambunyalambul, Wurundjeri Bala, Nirina Muddenbik, Bill Nicholson. That's welcome, greetings, good day from the Wurundjeri people. My name is Uncle Bill Nicholson. I'd like to acknowledge my elders past for some very special reasons. My elders' strength to fight the inequality and disrespect which was shown to them at colonisation. I'd like to acknowledge my elders past for their, I hate this word, adaptability to adapt to the environmental changes over tens of thousands of years. Luckily, and to me very preciously, the stories of the creation of Naarm, Geelong, Corio, which is now called Port Phillip Bay, and the Birrarung, the Yarra River itself, are over 10,000 years old and still exist today. And I'd also like to acknowledge my elders past for my survival, because my people's survival. Because to be honest with you, the genocidal policies of the past tried to eradicate Aboriginal people off the face of our sacred land. So I'd like to acknowledge my elders past for their strength, for their identity for myself, and also our survival. So who is Wurundjeri? Wurundjeri are the surviving clan of the Woiwurrung language group. I won't go into great detail, I won't have time to tell you about all country, but the great symbol of our connection to country is the Birrarung. Birrarung Ma, banks of the Misty River, now known as the Yarra River, our symbol of physical and spiritual connection to this sacred country. I'd like to acknowledge the 7 fallen clans, the ones that lived in areas like Melton, Sunbury, Bacchus Marsh, out at Cranbourne, out at Berwick, the clans that did not survive the impacts of colonisation. I'd like to acknowledge each and every one of them for caring for this sacred country so we can benefit today. Traditional life, what was it like? Well, I can stand up here for a long time to tell you about it, but I'll give you a snapshot. It was very efficient, 2 to 6 hours a day to sustain your family. So if you're working full time today, you're working less than my ancestors did. A very structured society under traditional law, a very sustainable society. Well, the oldest site I actually know is out in the, near the Brimbank Park, Maribyrnong Escarpment area there, around 42,000 years. Also a very knowledgeable society, where you'd actually hit adulthood at puberty, a lot younger than what you do today, because you had that input of broad knowledge from the extended family to teach you maturity, responsibility, and the skills and knowledge to survive on this country. And also a very fit and healthy culture. And I always mention this in my welcomes. because I'll see if you can guess the game, but it is a symbol of our fit and healthy interactive culture and the way our young people were brought up, where a possum skin ball was booted in the air and people would fly through the air to grab that ball. Well, we've recently been through the AFL Finals series. We call it Marngrook, and it has been played here for tens of thousands of years. The colonial period, I'll give you a little bit of a snapshot of history. Now, in an Aboriginal perspective, the Great Mindai. See, the rainbow serpent, the stories from up north don't relate here. We don't have pythons. We have snakes that will kill you if you don't get proper medical attention. So the stories about the disease and all the negativity that occurred after colonisation was symbolised by the great serpent, Mindai. Also, the failed treaties, the only attempted treaty ever to occur in this country, and Australia still today is the only Commonwealth country without a treaty with its Indigenous people. Didn't happen. It only happened about 20 or 30 k's from where we are today with John Batman. And also the Corranderk Reservation. If you've never heard of that name and you live here in Melbourne, it's a good idea to have a bit of a research or a bit of a look up of what Corranderk was. Corranderk's where now the township of Healesville is a great symbol of our ability to adapt, survive, but we still had struggles because policies tried to remove our kids and our families and off the land and all that sort of stuff. So people like William Barrack, who are a great symbol of our fight, of our survival, and also our wisdom, because William adapted us to the colonial way of living and we were very successful at it. It's unfortunate policies of the past did not allow us to thrive, and that is why if you read social statistics today, Aboriginal people still suffer from the negativities of social life, and that is because of the impacts of colonisation that still resonate to today. So what is a welcome to country? Well, traditionally, I'll mention a modern day concept. If you flew into Tullamarine Airport, which is named after one of my ancestors, or if you're planning to fly out, Australian LAW law says that you need a passport, or you're not going anywhere. So LORE law is the welcome to country. It's called Tandarum. It gave you access or a passport to this country. And I'll mention it very briefly. You were offered vegetation to symbolise your access to the resources. The snapping of spears symbolised your safety. The offering of water symbolised respect and relationship building between the different groups. And the walking through smoke of burning leaves symbolised what we call the cleansing of Murup, which is spirit. Now, the old people believe your spirit still exists on this land, even when your physical body no longer exists. So we believe in good and bad spirit, and we don't want the bad one here, so we cleanse people through the smoking ceremony. Now, I won't light the fire up here. It's a bit difficult on the 12th story of a building, but I'd just like to say, to feel truly welcome to Wurundjeri country, respect of culture, people and country must be maintained under Wurundjeri law. And by asking me here to speak on behalf of my community for your gathering, you show that respect. And again, I say thanks for that. So, Waminjika Yiman Wurundjeri Balak Walambiek, welcome to Wurundjeri home, welcome to Wurundjeri country. I really hope you enjoy gathering this arvo. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Uncle Bean, and I too would like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting today on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and we pay our respects to the elders and the past, present and future, and more importantly we thank them for allowing us to share in this land of theirs. And for me, the acknowledgement to country is more about shared belonging, and I think you've welcomed us into this land, successive waves of migration, and it is very important for us to actually reflect on the meaning and the deep meaning of the acknowledgement to country. And to welcome to country, I should say. Thank you very much. I have the really privileged position today of not having to speak for too long, simply because we have managed to put together a very short video which will summarize to you the key, the key achievements of the UNESCO chair in its first term. UNESCO chairs are essentially appointed on a four-year term basis, and we've just recently completed the first 4 years of the UNESCO chair. And I thought, in terms of me telling you what we did, which would be very boring, and we're here to listen to Tim anyway, in a minute, I thought we will actually show you very briefly, in 3-4 minutes, I think, a video that will highlight some of the key areas of emphasis within UNESCO, why it is very important for us that we engage in this kind of research, and where do we fit, if you like, in the global picture of knowledge construction as it is perceived and driven by UNESCO. But before I do that, and I've got 7 minutes in my proceeding order that I need to stick to. We've got 3 minutes for the video, 4, so I've got 2-3 minutes that I can spare here. I wanted to obviously thank Tim for accepting to be the orator this year, 2017. And the reason is the kind of work that the Race Discrimination Commissioner does is actually at the crux of the work that you're trying to do, which is build strong scientific basis about some of the most complex social problems that we are facing. And there is none, in my view, much deeper, much more touching than the current state of social cohesion in Australia, race relations, new forms of racism in many parts of our society, and in particular affecting many groups amongst us who are extremely vulnerable. And I think Tim is very courageous because he is not a zero-sum thinking type of guy. He tackles issues heads on, and in many cases, and I follow Tim's work, and we've shared many floors together, and I know that where he comes from positions of conviction that the situation is not as bad as some commentators make it sound, and yet with this ample improvement that we can all make in order to achieve a much more inclusive society, much more equitable society, much more respectful society. And I think that all starts with us individually. And I think this is where a critical stance on race relations has to start, from within. Then we really should extend that to external groups in society. I would like to acknowledge that the UNESCO chair has a team, and members of the team are here, PhD students, some staff are here. We have a very strong team supported by administrative team too, assistants. And we acknowledge, and I want to say, I haven't said this before, Jane and Brenda, but we do acknowledge the great support we get from Deakin and the faculty too, and the Deputy Vice Chancellor Research, of course, that allows us to be able to engage in a very ambitious project that cuts across research, policy, that is, we engage with policy, but also training new scholars, and also dissemination. And when I look at Kayla, she's going to start playing the video, but the video will tell you a little bit more about that. So thank you all for being here. This is wonderful to see so many people. And this shows to us that some of the issues that the chair is engaging with are really issues that touch all of us, either directly or indirectly. So Kayla will play the do. As soon as the video finishes, our Vice Chancellor, Professor Jane Den Holladay, will come to the floor and she will offer a welcome speech. So thank you for that.
It's a great privilege to be the host of this UNESCO chair particularly. Deakin and the faculty pride themselves on their strong sense of social justice, cultural inclusion, and the way in which we welcome. So for me, one of the most important lines in the Deakin strategic plan is welcome the committed and the capable. This chair is significant because it symbolises people changing their circumstances. It symbolises people coming together to learn from and with each other, regardless of class, race or gender, and to use that to change our community. It's wonderful to have the UNESCO chair at Deakin. Our very central focus is to provide for our students and our partners in research in the community a truly global focus to the way we go about our work, to look at global issues, to understand global problems, and to bring global solutions and ideas to actually realise change locally. So the international component of the chair, the fact that it is a UNESCO chair, drives our outward-looking focus, drives the opportunity for us to look beyond my own experience, to look beyond each of our individual experiences, and to join those up, and to find collective new knowledge, to find collective ways of changing and improving the world in which we live.
So the chair, during the first 4 years of its inception, was tasked mainly with developing a research program which is aligned with the UNESCO priority areas. The priority areas for UNESCO are essentially to conduct research and disseminate that research in areas of poverty eradication, good governance, leadership training, dealing with youth problems, in particular in the Global South. So the chair in its first term was really working on developing the foundations for a genuinely collaborative program. UNESCO obviously emphasizes teaching and education, and one of the key goals of UNESCO is actually education for all, quality education for all, irrespective of where they come from. And we see that training good researchers as a fundamental part of sustaining knowledge production processes, and in particular in areas where there are some problems in relation to knowledge and existing gaps. UNESCO in particular, perhaps more than any other agency in the UN, sees a strong mandate to be really on building capacity in the Global South, but also a capacity in relation to building the scientific and the educational capacity of the Global South. There is a big problem within the global knowledge production, which is an imbalance between what the North produces and what the Global South produces. And UNESCO sees part of its mandate is to try to narrow and bridge that gap. So working with colleagues in the Global South, working with civil society organizations in the Global South, working with youth from the Global South is a fundamental part of what UNESCO does. We had a number of successful projects undertaking since the establishment of the chair in 2013. Most recently in 2017, for instance, a book that was developed as part of the UNESCO Unitwin network, and that book was on the new concept of intercultural dialogue or interculturalism at the crossroads, looking at issues of policy, issues of theory and issues of practice. Other work produced on global migration, in particular with an emphasis on women, and a number of other papers and special issues of journals which looked into diaspora communities, migrant communities, issues of racism, and issues of social marginalization of youth. A lot of that research is part and parcel of what the chair does. So having the UNESCO Orations as an annual event involving high-profile public speakers who advocate for some of these issues, I think is very, very important, because it reaches out to a different audience, it communicates some of the messages in a much more accessible manner, and also it highlights the plight of a number of individuals and communities in our societies which otherwise would not have a voice. So for instance, in inviting Nobel Peace Prize Rigobert Menschel to deliver the oration in 2015 was really highlighting the struggle of the indigenous communities of South America and the indigenous communities globally, and what it takes for those struggles to actually achieve outcomes for those communities. The next 4 years are going to be extremely busy for the chair. We have already started a number of very exciting projects, none more so perhaps than trying to develop the first ever global index on intercultural dialogue. So this hasn't happened before. We're trying to look at how different societies are tracking in relation to social peace using the instrument of intercultural dialogue, and a number of other projects, in particular around multicultural education and how different jurisdictions approach multicultural education in terms of resourcing professional training, and in terms of how that plays out in reality in schools.
I begin by acknowledging also the owners of this land, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I particularly thank Bill. Bill, thank you. You always do it so elegantly and so humanely, and you are so generous in your forgiveness. It's a pleasure to have you with us again and to hear what you have to say. I also extend my respect to any other Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders besides Bill who are with us today. We of course acknowledge our 2017 UNESCO Chair, Orator Dr. Tim Soutphommasane. Tim, wonderful to have you with us. I know how busy you are. Australia's Race Discrimination Commissioner has lots to do and is frequently in the press, and we are the better for it. Our Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research, Peter Hodgson, is here, the Executive Dean, Professor Brenda Cheretnichenko, Professor Fethi Mansouri, Director of the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation, and pretty much half your team are here, or if not, probably 90% of your team are here. So to the whole of ADRI and everyone who's associated, it's nice to have you. Deakin staff, other Deakin students outside of ADRI, Deakin graduates, guests one and all, particularly our colleagues from other universities. I'm delighted to welcome you all here to Melbourne, to Deakin Downtown. We've not been in here that long. We're still having technical difficulties with this particular facility, but we will get there. And of course, this is our fifth UNESCO Chair Lecture. We have done outstandingly well over the 5 years, Fethi, and I do congratulate you. I think it was a great thing for us to get, but I always had this slight vague worry that we wouldn't be able to live up to the glory of a UNESCO chair, and I can say unreservedly that 5 years on, and I think I've been to every single lecture, that it gets better and better, and I'm sure it's ADRI that's pulled the crowd, even if we do think it's Tim deep down. We're very proud of this chair for its prestige, a chair which takes a global and cross-disciplinary lead on such an important international issue, is located at Deakin under the leadership and expertise of a very talented team led by Fethi Mansouri. I'm looking forward to this evening's oration on middle-class racism. The poisonous effects of racism can so often be obscured by middle-class values or by the scapegoating of others. Many of us know this very well. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce this evening's guest speaker, Dr. Tim Soutphommasane, Australia's Race Discrimination Commissioner. In 2015, Deakin University was honoured to award Dr. Soutphommasane with an honorary Doctor of Letters for his distinguished contribution to learning in the fields of multiculturalism and citizenship. Dr. Soutphommasane has been Australia's Race Discrimination Commissioner since August 2013. And prior to joining the Australian Human Rights Commission, Tim was a political philosopher and held posts at the University of Sydney and Monash University. His thinking on multiculturalism, on patriotism, and national identity has been influential in shaping debates in Australia and Britain. Tim is the author of 4 books, most famously and most movingly for many of us, I'm Not Racist, But in 2015, The Virtuous Citizen in 2012, Don't Go Back to Where You Came From, also in 2012, and Reclaiming Patriotism in 2009. He was co-editor with Nick Dyrenfirth on All That's Left in 2010. He has been an opinion columnist with The Age and with the Weekend Australian newspapers and presented documentary series Mongrel Nation on ABC's Radio National. He is an adjunct professor at the School of Social Sciences and Psychology of Western Sydney University and chairs the Leadership Council on Cultural Diversity. Born in France, raised in southwest Sydney, he holds a Doctor of Philosophy and a Master of Philosophy with distinction from the University of Oxford and is a first-class honours graduate of the University of Sydney. It's a great pleasure, and on your behalf I do welcome Dr. Tim Soutphommasane to the 5th UNESCO lecture.
Well, good evening, everyone. To the Wurundjeri people, may I acknowledge your traditional ownership of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. And Bill, thank you again for that welcome. I saw you last Friday, of course, here in Melbourne too. May I also acknowledge Vice-Chancellor Den Hollander, someone who I know has a deep personal commitment to human rights and anti-racism. And may I also thank Professor Fethi Mansouri for the invitation to join you tonight. As the UNESCO Chair, Fethi has made many important contributions to our understanding of cultural diversity and social justice, and I know there are many more contributions to come. I also want to acknowledge the work of your institute and your colleagues. Without singling anyone out, I just want to pay special mention to Yin Paradies and his work on racism, upon which we draw regularly. I'm delighted tonight also to continue my personal association with Deakin. On a previous occasion, I reflected that as a graduate student in political philosophy, I presented my first conference paper here at Deakin back in 2007, I believe, and I was honoured to accept that honour from the university in 2015 as well. Not long ago, I was reminded of a passage from Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, in which he reflects upon the nature of racism. Let me quote it, and some of the language will reflect the mores of the day. I must confess that over the last few years I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. Now, it's a passage that I believe challenges our sensibilities. For we often take for granted that on matters of race, what matters most is goodwill, that accepting others can be enough to overcome prejudice and division. Now, it can be easy to take from this passage of Dr. King's that we are doomed to fail on racial equality, that good intentions are bound to be frustrated, that we may never be able to remedy the social ill of discrimination. I don't think that's quite right. Dr. King was, after all, someone fond of quoting that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, something a recent President of the United States was also fond of quoting. Dr. King knew that progress could be slow, that the cause of justice was difficult, but that wasn't a reason to give up. It may seem strange to begin a conversation tonight about race by looking back to the America of 1963. Surely the Australia of 2017 is a very different place. You might say something like this: racism is unacceptable and warrants our condemnation, but it is largely a problem of the past. Real racism is what you had with the segregation of the American South, the apartheid regime in South Africa, or the White Australia policy and assimilation of Aboriginal people. Things are different now, though. We are a multicultural society. People get along with people from other races. In fact, we are one of the most tolerant and welcoming countries on earth. We are a society that is now colourblind, a society where race is invisible. You might say something like this: now, it's true that we are one of the multicultural success stories of the world. According to the evidence, we are also one of the most racially tolerant countries in the world. Yet racism does still exist, and it does continue to blight the lives of many. And to bring it back to that passage from Dr. King, in the here and now, we too see prejudice that emanates not only from malice, but sometimes from goodwill and from half-hearted acceptance, as well as outright rejection. This evening, I'd like to reflect on how racism today comes in many forms. We seem to find it hard to talk about its more subtle varieties. but such varieties can do as much damage as their more overt or violent counterparts. This is because racism lives not only through laws and institutions, but also through culture and attitudes. It exists not only through acts done by one person on another, but also through the rules, norms, and systems that exist in our society. What is the face of racism today in Australia? We've become familiar with a certain genre of racism. It involves abuse or vilification. Sometimes it escalates to physical violence. It's often done in anger, often done by someone seemingly possessed by hatred. And when it happens, often somewhere on a bus or on a train or on a tram, it's captured by camera. The footage is shared online, maybe on Facebook or Twitter, and then not long after, news outlets pick it up and run it on the nightly news bulletin. These episodes tend to be roundly condemned. Racist outbursts in public don't enjoy many defenders. We're pretty good at making clear that racist violence has no place in our society. You might say that when it comes to acts of high-level racism, if we want to call it that, Australians are nearly unanimous in taking the approach of zero tolerance. Few would ever openly endorse the idea of racial discrimination. This helps explain why, quite often, the response to episodes of overt racism follows a script. In conversations about nasty or violent racist incidents, we often hear condemnation, quickly followed by speculation about the state of mind of the perpetrators. Racist ranters can be described as clearly having issues with their state of mind or with their mental health, because no reasonable person, no reasonable Australian in their right mind would ever descend to such beastly behaviour. Just as a quick aside, I've observed as well that on occasions when I've commented on public incidents, that some people take issue even with describing acts of racism as involving racism at all. I get told sometimes they don't involve racism, it's just antisocial or violent behaviour motivated by bad mental health or mental illness. It's curious how some choose not to judge some behaviour based on clearly observable characteristics, say the presence of racial hostility, but rather on some speculative insight into another person's mind and welfare. But if I return to my larger point, nasty or vicious racism isn't the most common form of racism you see in our society. There are other forms of it, and it doesn't need to involve racial abuse or vilification. There are times, perhaps, when people understand things well enough to know that they can't be openly racist. No one wants the stigma or opprobrium of engaging in naked racial hostility. There are times, for example, when opinions based on prejudice will be expressed indirectly or between the lines. There can be just enough room left for plausible deniability. Racism isn't always brutish or boorish. It can sometimes be rather sophisticated. You don't need to use a foghorn if you can use a dog whistle. Then there are times when racism needn't involve malevolence. It can be something said or done out of ignorance or insensitivity. Rather than involving a high level of sophistication, such racism can involve the very opposite, clumsiness, if you will. I think here of what we often call casual racism, where people say or do things that have racist implications without necessarily intending to inflict racist humiliation. Psychologists, and there may be a few of you here tonight, also point to another aspect of prejudice and motivation, namely that people can take part in racist speech and behaviour not because they subscribe to certain beliefs, but because it helps them to form bonds within a group. It can help to form a stronger sense of us through creating a stronger sense of them. racism can involve as much a group's needs for identity as it does actual hatred directed at others. We don't deal with these varieties of racism as deftly as we do with open racial hostility. When we see casual racism of the sort that I've described, we can tend to give people the benefit of the doubt. People can explain away remarks as being just a joke or just a bit of harmless fun, banter, social lubricant. Sometimes people object to the label of racism by saying that those who take issue with it are being overly sensitive or indeed being politically correct. Which brings me to how we must define racism today. If we believe that racism is essentially about belief or doctrine, that it is about racial superiority or racial hierarchy, then we can end up with an incomplete picture. As I would define it, racism refers to prejudice, discrimination, or hatred directed at someone because of their race. It is something that creates disadvantages for some and confers privilege onto others. It's a basic definition, but when you understand things this way, you recognize that racism isn't just about intentions, it is ultimately about impact. Class is one reason people can struggle with recognizing subtle racism. Many of us, whether expressly or not, like to see racism in terms of class. A bold assertion, you might think. But I often hear in public forums, for example, that the root of racism is not hatred but ignorance, that almost all of it can be explained by a lack of learning. People often tell me that the cure to racism is education. And to be clear, I'm not for a moment here suggesting that those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds can't be well educated or educated well enough on matters of race. What I'm trying to highlight, though, is one of the default explanations we offer on racism. In many liberal democracies, racism is seen as a problem not of the middle class or the elites, but as a problem of the working class, as a product of proletarian prejudice, if you like. Consider, for example, recent commentary about the rise of nationalist populism across the West. The narrative runs that those drawn to anti-immigration and xenophobic political parties are disillusioned members of the working class. To pick a very specific example, let's focus on the United States. Shortly after the election of Donald Trump to the White House, it became received wisdom that the Democrats lost because they had failed to listen to the concerns of the white working class. By contrast, Trump had made himself the candidate of the anxious and the dispossessed. His pledge of making America great again tapped into a reservoir of civic faith. But more than this, he embodied in himself something of the everyman. As J.D. Vance described in his memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, Trump reminded blue-collar workers of themselves. He was a relatable, black-slapping swashbuckler, unafraid of saying what was on his mind. He was a man who talks about politics and policy as if he were sitting around the dinner table. According to the conventional wisdom, Trump's authenticity was really only a factor or a symptom. What really explained things was class. In his assessment, the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, who writes for The Atlantic, neatly characterises the orthodox explanation of Trumpian populism. And I quote from him. "We are now being told that support for Trump's Muslim ban, his scapegoating of immigrants, his defences of police brutality, are somehow the natural outgrowth of the cultural and economic gap between Lena Dunham's America and Jeff Foxworthy's. The collective verdict holds that the Democratic Party lost its way when it abandoned everyday economic issues like job creation for the softer fare of social justice." The indictment continues. "To their neoliberal economics, Democrats and Liberals have married a condescending elitist effect that sneers at blue-collar culture and mocks the white man as history's greatest monster and primetime television's greatest doofus. In this rendition, Donald Trump is not the product of white supremacy so much as the product of a backlash against contempt for white working class people. End of quote. Such diagnoses have emerged too within Australian commentary about race. In a much cited essay for Meanjin, the writer Shannon Burns argued that progressive middle class political discourse has alienated lower class white Australians. Middle class grievances about racism and bigotry now drown out what he calls lower class pain, which explains why the wounded lower classes, quote, come to embrace conservative discourses that ridicule middle class anguish. If there is any kind of backlash against so-called political correctness, it is because those who cannot afford to see themselves as disadvantaged are instinctively repulsed by those who harp on about disadvantage. But is it the case that racial and cultural populism is a symptom of such working class alienation? Now let's examine the evidence for this. If we take a closer look, the evidence is far from convincing. One study in America of pre-election polling data, for example, indicates that those who supported Trump generally had a higher mean household income than those who did not support Trump. Another study highlights that of the 1 in 3 Americans who earn less than $50,000 a year, a majority voted not for Donald Trump, but for Hillary Clinton. As for the Australian context, data from the Australian Election Survey would seem to indicate that it is culture that has been behind some of the resurgent nationalism here. At least if we take the electoral resurgence of the One Nation Party as a proxy. The AES data shows that 98% of One Nation voters are Australian born. Now that's compared obviously to about the 74% of the Australian population at large that's Australian born. It shows as well that the most salient factor behind supporting One Nation is immigration. 82% of One Nation voters consider immigration extremely important when deciding how to vote, with 83% calling for immigration to be cut a lot. 79% of One Nation voters believe migrants increase crime. 67% believe migrants take our jobs. What some analyses of our contemporary situation reveal is perhaps a blind spot on race. The American writer Michael Phillips, reflecting on the rise of the white nationalist alt-right, so-called, in particular the figure of Richard Spencer, with whom some of you may be familiar, offers this perceptive insight. While many regard members of the alt-right to be just working-class discontents, the situation is anything but. There is such a thing as the well-educated and financially comfortable bigot. Those are Michael Phillips's words. In many cases, the only difference between the views of some respectable conservative voices and extreme nationalist ones in the United States is not core assumptions, but rather tone. Respectable members of the middle class and elite classes simply know how to say things about race in more circumspect or acceptable ways. As Phillips notes, American reporters from middle-class backgrounds seem shocked when they meet a racist who is apparently one of them, and not some cartoonish working-class caricature. The reality, though, has been that racism and elitism can make for an enduring blend. Now, let me quote from Phillips. Across the land, elite children have been fed a steady diet of white supremacist thinking. Education alone has never cured racism. In fact, higher education has often promoted it. Prominent American racists, from early 20th century eugenicist Madison Grant to President Woodrow Wilson to Charles Murray the right-wing polemicist and author of the infamous 1994 book The Bell Curve, which argued that black and brown people were congenitally less intelligent than whites, all brandished advanced degrees. The social Darwinist economy that elites have constructed depends on segmentation by colour. Segregation and imperialism sprang from elite minds. End of quote from Phillips. Here in Australia, if we turn the focus to home, if we want to consider what middle-class forms of racism looks or sounds like, just consider as an example the discussions we have about real estate. It takes only the mere mention of property prices sometimes to prompt people into venting about foreign buyers pricing the rest of us out of the housing market, and by that we mean specifically Chinese foreign buyers. Tabloid reporting, and indeed in the press formerly known as broadsheet, feeds us a regular diet of stories involving Chinese foreign buyers outbidding Aussie first homeowners or aspiring first homeowners in our suburbs, particularly in Melbourne and in Sydney. If you look at the evidence though, there is little evidence to demonstrate that Chinese foreign buyers are having a significant effect on property prices, except in one area. That's the luxury housing market. As for those who are identified as Chinese foreign buyers at auctions bidding, who are they exactly? They are more likely than not to be Australian citizens or permanent residents who just happen to come from an Asian heritage. Consider as well the current anxieties expressed about Chinese Australians acting as foreign agents of influence in our politics. To be clear, anyone who breaches Australian laws should be held to full account for their actions. And there are legitimate conversations to be had about integrity in our politics and about how our elected representatives interact with members of our polity, including those who are donors. But there is no law broken in someone possessing dual citizenship, no law broken in them seeking to participate in the Australian political system. Yet it can appear some in our public debate are only too eager to indulge in old fears of red influences from north and to have a broad brush of prejudice applied to all those Australians who have Chinese heritage or dual citizenship. It is revealing that we do not appear to be exercised in the same way by other dual citizens with heritage from other places who happen to fall foul of our laws. To be specific, the supreme law of our land, the Constitution. So, how are we to respond to all this? It begins obviously with a recognition that racism does come in many forms, and not just the crude and violent forms that we've come to associate with public racism. We must be prepared to deal with subtle and insidious racism. But as a general principle, we must be guided by the idea that it's not enough just to be a non-racist, we've also got to be anti-racist. As I've already noted, there's a tendency to regard racism as an antiquated feature of the past because we think of it in terms of doctrine and racial purity, when the modern reality is that it is more often than not something that emerges from other sources. It's ignorance, it's cultural anxiety that are the ready sources of contemporary racism, not just hatred. Some might say that focusing on less obvious forms of racism, or the banality of racism, can lead us to capture too much as prejudice and as discrimination. That we risk seeing racism in anything and everything. That if you go around wielding a hammer, everything begins to look like a nail. We must, of course, have tact in our conversations about race. We must also be prepared to give people, where appropriate, the benefit of the doubt. But we must also be prepared to listen to the lived experience of those who experience racism. Too often, such voices are drowned out by denials of racism or by those who wish to deflect meaningful conversations about racism. Too often, our conversations feature only those who have the benefit of not being constantly reminded that they are visibly different, but who are then adamant that our society treats race as invisible. Too often, those who have the courage to respond to prejudice are made to feel that they are the ones who have done wrong. We must not indulge the idea that responding to racism creates more division than the perpetration of racism. On all this, having leadership on race is essential. Our leaders should do nothing to give license to hatred, prejudice, or ignorance. Our public debates help to set the tone of our society. And where there is any encouragement of intolerance, we will more likely than not find such encouragement somewhere being taken up. We must also continue to have effective laws against racism. For the past 4 years or so, we've had enormous debate about the Racial Discrimination Act and its provisions concerning racial vilification. There have been 2 attempts to amend Section 18C, which makes it unlawful to offend, insult, humiliate, or intimidate someone because of their race. Now, I believe there remains no compelling reason for changing the current law. Section 18C sets a standard for our society. We must not send any signal that racism is acceptable or that we condone the racial abuse or vilification of others without consequences. A law such as the Racial Discrimination Act can only ever go part of the way, of course. Racism can't be eradicated by a single piece of legislation, however important it is to have such legislation. We must always continue and extend the work of educating people's attitudes. Now, that's one reason we run our Racism It Stops With Me campaign, an awareness campaign aimed at empowering people to speak out and to stand up against prejudice and discrimination. And since 2012, more than 400 organisations have been supporters of the campaign. That includes Deakin University, which has been a very proud supporter of the campaign. Last week we released 2 anti-racism videos as part of Racism It Stops With Me. They deal with scenarios of everyday and casual racism. They aim to highlight how prejudice and discrimination needn't always be overt. They reflect research which finds that there are some groups who experience significantly higher rates of racial discrimination, most obviously Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But research also indicates that those from African backgrounds experience significantly higher rates of racism. The videos also reflect our own experience at the Australian Human Rights Commission. Last financial year, we found that nearly 40% of our racial discrimination complaints involved either employment or the provision of goods and services. Assuming the technology comes through, I now want to show you these 2 videos.
Remain long.
Where to?
He's first.
Oh, it's okay. I'll take you.
No, it's not okay. He was next. Allow me.
Thank you.
Look, the message from the videos is very simple. It is about giving people some guidance to having the courage and the confidence to respond to racism, because many people struggle with knowing exactly what to do when they see it occurring. We often have silence or indifference, not because people condone or endorse what has happened, but because they are unsure of what the right thing to do is. But the videos are also aimed at starting a conversation. We know that a conversation about racism isn't always easy. It can be fraught, it can be met with resistance, it can cause discomfort. If some of you aren't feeling uncomfortable or some sense of discomfort tonight, then I'm not doing my job properly too. But it requires tact and nuance. So let me conclude with some reflections on how it is exactly that we can go about talking about race and racism. I believe there are a number of general principles that can give us guidance. First, as I've already mentioned, it's not just about racial superiority. We get caught up in what I regard as a dictionary definition of racism that defines it only according to doctrine and belief. You don't need to be a Ku Klux Klan member in order to do something with racist effects. On this, we have the authority of Martin Luther King, if you're in doubt. Second, let's not get too defensive. We know that race is difficult, as I've said, but often we hear people say that we make too much fuss about racism in Australia when racism is much worse in other countries. We shouldn't divert things this way. Yes, Australia is, by international standards, a highly tolerant society, but that doesn't deny that those who experience discrimination experience a real harm to their dignity and their equality. Those who insist they are colourblind are often themselves blind to the lived experience of others who continue to be judged by their race and their colour. Third, we must avoid saying that copying racism must be part of some initiation rite for any group in our society. Some say that just as the Irish or Italians or Greeks or later migrant groups, such as the Vietnamese or Chinese, copped ugliness, so too must newer groups. They must just cop it. Some say that racism only serves to make people more resilient. And we should welcome it because we are stronger for having been abused. I've never heard of anyone, by the way, say that they've been grateful for the experience of being subjected to racism. It simply isn't good enough to say that the targets of racism must grin and bear it or that there's nothing we can do. That amounts to normalising racism. As for resilience, let's be clear too. While there are stories of those who do have the resilience to ride out racism, for every story of resilience, I imagine there are many more stories where racism has broken people. It's just that we don't talk about it or we don't admit to it. Who, after all, wants to admit that they've been broken? Resilience here is a double-edged sword. Finally, racism matters to all of us. It implicates all of us. Racism mustn't be an issue that matters only to minorities. Those fortunate not to experience racism must understand that they have a part to play, that social progress happens only when society and people are big enough to stand alongside those who are mistreated or who experience injustice. Which leads me to the video, not quite yet, but we say racism, it stops with me because racism diminishes all of us, but all of us have a role in stopping it.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that. I just want to very briefly say that you've connected so many different dots in this very difficult subject matter, none more so than bringing the words of Martin Luther King to the issues of institutional racism. And that reminds me very much that we in academic institutions, we have to remember that it was only in the first half of the 20th century that we had a very influential school of thought in America, the Chicago School of Anthropology, which argued still that if only African Americans were able to assimilate and learn the manners of the white people, all their problems would have been solved. And that has penetrated academic scholarship for so long, and that really brings us to the perhaps the reality that it stops with all of us, be it policymakers, academics, or activists. And that brings me to one of the final acts tonight, which is to invite our Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Peter Hodgson, to come and say a few words.
Thanks so much, Fetty. This is my second oration I've been to, and they've both been actually very moving experiences. I thought that the actual start of the evening, that Uncle Bill really kicked off and set the scene in many ways with his speech about the issues with the Aboriginal people, and set a really nice platform for what happened later on. Tim's talk to me was the great thing about the job I have is I get to see a whole lot of different types of research. Last night I was opening a centre for meta-analysis research, which is, and I learnt quite a lot from that talk, but tonight I learnt a lot as well. And I'm an engineer, for those who don't know, and I think the chance in this role to experience a whole range, different ranges of thinking, different ranges of research practice, etc., is really exciting. I thought what was clear about Tim's talk tonight was about asking real questions that affect society. And I think Brenda has been in my ear quite a lot about that all research should have the human side involved in it, in terms of whatever. And so that was really, really important aspect to me. And the thing was, it was about deep thinking. It wasn't the surface thinking that we all hear about. It wasn't racism as we hear in the everyday media. It was actually going much deeper down. So I thought Tim gave some really, really great insights into things that maybe we don't take as racist in everyday life, but really, actually, as you said, really do affect the individuals involved on the other end of the conversation. I've had the pleasure myself, I've been director of IFM, where we had about 45 different nationalities, and at Deakin I think we have about 120 something nationalities now studying at Deakin. And you sometimes, it's very hard to get your head around that sort of the different cultures, the different needs, etc., etc. But I felt that was a really, it's something which we have to really address and really think about deeply. So I thought that was really very, very good. And I think the other important thing you said was, it's not about the intentions we might have, it's the impact we cause. And that was a very clear message to me that, you might not intending to do something, but by whatever you've done, you're going to have a deep impact on that individual. And you might not realise it. So that was really good. And I thought the last bit was that we have to have some actions out of this, that we have to be the anti-racist, not just be neutral, but we actually have to go out there and be vocal in what we believe in. And that we have to defend the laws which are really important to us. And I think that all of us in the room have to do that. And the racism that stops with me, I think that's a great campaign. I think that the other thing to me I took away from the whole thing was that, and it's from the audience point of view now, we couldn't shut you up to get you in here. You're bubbling away, but you could have dropped a pin during the talk. So it seems to me that this talk connected with many of you at various levels. And so I think that's, to me, a sign of a great orator and a great oration. So I'd like to congratulate Fetty and his team for what he's done, but particularly thank Tim for coming along and giving the talk. Thank you, Tim. Now I'd like to invite the Vice-Chancellor, Jane Den-Hollander, AO, to come and say a few words.
Well, I'm here to thank everyone, but I'll just also reflect, as many of you know, I was born in Zambia, I was educated in South Africa right through apartheid. And one of the greatest days of my life was sitting in front of a television in Cardiff, and with our two small children and Jerome, and it was a beautiful sunny day. It always rains in Cardiff, but it was a spectacular day. And it was the day Nelson Mandela was coming out of jail. And it was in Cape Town, and they had him incarcerated. And I'd never seen him. Most South Africans had never seen him. There's this one famous photograph of him. And we waited and we waited, and it was all going to happen at 11 o'clock, 2 o'clock, nothing, 3 o'clock, nothing. And then suddenly this man appeared. And Winnie had her hand up, you know, she had her fist up. And he's this very tall, spare man, and he stops. And he says, "We will forgive, but we don't forget, and there will be reconciliation." And it showed the man who had endured, at that stage, 60 years of his life in a racist environment. The last 30 years of it had been in a salt mine where he'd lost his sight. And he came out and he was already thinking about how he was going to get the community. He was always anti-racist. And that's what struck me when you said about being anti-racist. Mandela, whatever he spoke, Madiba, whenever he spoke, he always said, we must be against racism. But now we'll talk to find how we're going to communicate. So Tim, thank you. You always do a very moving oration, because you always take us back to where it really matters, which is in the human interaction. And the impact of what we say and do is so profound always. And we all often make mistakes. And I think it's not so much the making the mistake, it's the capacity to understand and then to learn. And thank you very much. I love those ads. I think the Lyft ad with the two women is just fabulous. We've all watched those sort of things happen every day, and now I feel bad that we haven't stepped up. And we all need to step up every day and not concede an inch, not 1 millimetre on what is happening in our community to suggest that some of this is okay and that there's some kind of special way that we deal with these things. You are absolutely right. It is unacceptable. And we thank you for being here today. To a great audience, thank you very much for listening. And I hope you go away and that you feel enabled and courageous to do good, because we've just heard from someone spectacular. To all of you, thank you. And once again, we'll do something about the sound.